Hi everyone. Today we'll be looking at Unit 3. We started Unit 3 review. We're starting today with language. So, the first topic we're going through is what we call patterns and distribution of language, which is going to lead us to kind of where we find languages and how they're spread out throughout the world, right? There are a number of different ethnic groups, ethnicities, histories of people, and with just as many histories, we have just as many languages too, which you'll see to be the case. Now, of course, there are a number of different languages in the world, right? Some more populated than others, what we call major languages, right? And some of them are here on your screen. And for the most part, you should be able to pick out a few of these, right? We can look at things like English, right? Hello, hola for Spanish, bonjour for French. We have some kanji here, right, for Japanese. We have some German here, hallo, some Russian, some Arabic, and some Swedish too, right? We're not so concerned with the specific languages just yet. We're going to get there. But what we want to focus on first is the fact that for every language we have, it stems from a language family, right? Now, we have a number of language families, these common language groups that are tied together. And as we can see here, we have a pretty uneven distribution of these families throughout the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we have just one language that's going on, right? We have lots of different languages, but some of them fall into the same language family, and contrary to what you might think, there are some languages that seem very, very different that actually came from the same common ancestor. Now, here in this chart, we can see that the majority of languages spoken in the world, nearly 50%, come from this Indo-European language family. And it's an important one, and we're going to talk through that. And we can look through these other language families as well, from Sino-Tibetan to Niger-Congo, Afroasiatic, Austronesian, Dravidian, Turkic, Japonic. Right, it's a little foreshadowing here. Austroasiatic, Tai-Kadai, and Koreanic, etc., etc. We see these different language families. But we're going to start with Indo-European first. Now, Indo-European origins come from two different hypotheses. One, which we might call the nomadic warrior theory, or the Kurgan hypothesis, and the other, which we might call the sedentary farmer theory, or the Anatolian theory, or the Renfrew hypothesis. And both of these seek to explain just how this Indo-European stuff got to where it is today, right? How it started spreading from people to people, and how that contributed to it being, the largest language family represented in the world today. Now, according to the Renfrew hypothesis, we had farmers as the key kind of spreaders of Indo-European, what we would call Proto-Indo-European, right? This not quite a language yet, but starting to become a language, and that coincided for this particular hypothesis, right, the sedentary farmer theory, with the first agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution. As farming started to spread out of the Fertile Crescent, out of Mesopotamia, we started to see that language spread too, through relocation diffusion, right? People moving from place to place and spreading the language with them. As it spread to new areas, it interacted with other indigenous languages that were popping up at that time and evolved and transformed into the languages that eventually into the languages we know today. There are always going to be these kind of historical forms of English and German and French, etc., right? Gaulish, right, for French, things like that. But they were influenced by this one particular proto-language, right? On the other end, with the nomadic warrior theory, we see this group called the Kurgans, who started in what would be kind of southwestern Russia, northern Kazakhstan, and from here they spread through conquest and through nomadic lifestyles from place to place, in order to spread that language. And as they conquered and as they reached new areas, they were able to spread the language with them. So we ended up with these two different hypotheses, two different theories about why the language is spreading the way it is. Began with one side, the nomadic warrior theory, the Kurgan people who used kind of the use of domesticated animals, who used conquest to find their way from place to place and then spread the language in that way. And then the sedentary farmer theory, beginning with the Anatolians in modern-day Turkey, Mesopotamia, where as the Neolithic revolution took place and as farming spread from place to place, so too did this proto-language. Right? Regardless of the case, regardless of which theory ends up being the correct one, or is touted as being the correct one, the same thing held true. As the language moved from place to place to place, the language changed, it adapted, right? It took on some of these cultural traits, some of these language traits from other languages that were developing at the time, until eventually we get, these new full-fledged languages. Now today we can see the influence of Indo-European through this map, right? And here we're looking at a map that has Indo-European classified as being an official or primary language or being some language of importance. Right? This is all for Indo-European language, all the various ones that are contained within the Indo-European language family. And we can see that there are large swaths of the earth where at minimum we have an Indo-European language as a recognized or at least significant language, right? And that's pretty much every spot on the globe. And that's not an accident, right? As we've looked at before, nothing happens in a vacuum. There are specific causes for things being the way that they are. Now, within the Indo-European language family tree, we can see a number of different languages, right? Ones that you may think are not completely related to each other, but actually are. All right, so here's our trunk, our Indo-European family. These are our branches out here into our groups, and finally into the actual languages here at the ends, right? And you can see that we have this Indo-European split. So we have this Indo-Iranian subgroup, and then this European subgroup that get into the actual branches of this tree, right? This kind of family tree of languages, if you would. Now, the ones that are maybe most important, and they're the ones that we want to focus on at least, are the following: English, German, Italian, Spanish, Hindi, Bengali. We can see with Indo-European, right, if we trace our branch, we can see that English is in the Anglo-Frisian subgroup, and the West Germanic sub-branch and the Germanic branch out of the Indo-European language family. So too is German, still in the Germanic branch, and it's also a connection we see with the words, right? Kind of loan words that we think of, or words that are very similar, right? So like words for hello, right? Hello, hallo in German and in English, and vice versa in that case, have common pronunciations, have common sources as a greeting, right, or a way of greeting someone. And it's not a coincidence, all right? That's just a matter of some language in the past branching off and eventually becoming English on one end, and then eventually becoming the German that we have today on the other end. Italian and Spanish are more connected than German and English are because they're in the same branch, in this case in the Romance branch instead. All right, so we'll see a lot of cognates, right, as we might call them. You may have heard your Spanish teacher talk about cognates before. And we'll see this happen more in these particular groupings because they're within the same branch, which means that they're more connected. Right? Think of this as your family versus your cousin's family, that kind of thing. Now, even though these languages are very different, we still have a lot of commonalities with Hindi, Bengali, and even though the vocab is different, even though the grammar may be different, these all were sourced from that original Indo-European language, a Proto-Indo-European language. All right. Now, an easy way to remember Indo-European, aside from just memorizing, which languages are in the family tree, are to think of it this way. We have Indo-European as the family, this nice hyphen for us. And so what we can do is break this hyphen, and what we're going to end up with is Indo on one side, European on the other. And so most any language you can think of as being found in Europe is an Indo-European language. That makes sense. On the other end, any language you can think of as being in or around India more than likely is going to fall into this Indo-European language family too. Now, the important ones to know would be things like Punjabi, Hindi, Bengali, because those are kind of the major languages that we see within and around India. The European languages, right? We've talked about European groups that have traveled or traversed the earth, all right? The French, the Spanish, etc., etc., all right? Which is kind of a foreshadowing for what comes next too, right? Now, again, we have Indo-European as kind of the major language family in the world, right? Near 50% of people speaking an Indo-European language, but it's not the only one that's significant. We have the second family too, the Sino-Tibetan, which has a large chunk of the world population, 20%, speaking a language within its family too. Now, Sino-Tibetan we typically find in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and for the most part, we find these Sino-Tibetan languages in China in specific. All right, so you might have guessed, oh, they must be talking about Chinese, and we are. Within Chinese, though, within this kind of grouping of Chinese languages, we have lots of different subgroups of Chinese languages. Many recognized, some not, by the government of China or otherwise. But we can see that the large proportion of, Chinese languages spoken are spoken by people who speak Mandarin Chinese. All right, that's kind of the overarching group, and we can see here where we have about 836 million worldwide who are speaking Mandarin Chinese, compared to 45 million, 77 million, et cetera, et cetera. Right, we just have larger groups of people speaking Mandarin Chinese. So we're thinking about the languages that have the most speakers. We got to think about it in two ways, right? Because English, as you may have guessed, is kind of the language of the world, and there's reasons for that. And why Chinese isn't, even though Chinese has so many speakers overall. So we take a look at this chart instead, and we're going to take a look in this case at what we call first language speakers, right? Which is another way to say native language speakers. So this is looking at people who speak one of these languages as their first language. And we can see that by far Chinese outnumbers every other language with little to no competition. Now, if we look at the language families, right, because we're thinking of these family groups, right, Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, we would expect that Indo-European would take a large chunk of these spoken languages, right? So let's test that. Well, we have Chinese, which we know is Sino-Tibetan, right? We have Spanish, which is Indo-European. We have English, which is also Indo-European. Hindi, Indo-European. Arabic, which is Afro-Asiatic. Bengali, which is Indo-European. Portuguese, which is Indo-European. Russian, which is Indo-European. Japanese, which is Japonic, which is its kind of own outlier. So I have the star here. It kind of fits and was developed on its own, right? So there's not another kind of larger family group that it fits into. Being the island that it is, or the Japanese language, the Ryukyu languages in some sub-islands that are there too, kind of developed on their own in that way. And Landa, which is also Indo-European. Right, so we can see it makes sense. Indo-European taking most of these spots, and that's going to take up a proportion of the world who's speaking these languages. Chinese takes first spot for native speakers at least, and that's likely because there's just larger populations in China. Right, we're looking at over 1 billion people in the country compared to not that many in other places. So Chinese as a native language definitely takes the cake, if nothing else because we have larger proportions of people in China who are going to learn the language at some point, and who are more likely to learn it as their first language compared to others. Just more people going on. Now, if we think about spoken languages in general, right, we're not looking at native languages anymore. Right here, we're looking at the native language, the first one they speak. Here, we're looking at just any language that a person speaks and how many they speak. And we see that English ekes out its first place spot, right, in terms of the most spoken. So even though a speaker may have another native language, if we include the people who speak English as a second or a third or a fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth languages, right, for you polyglots out there, English takes the cake easily. From other groupings, not quite from China, right, it's a pretty close divide here, right, that we're looking at. And this is the most recent source, right, a 2020 source. We look at that comparison, we can see that Chinese has about 1.3 million speakers total, right, as native speakers. And then in terms of most spoken languages, we can see different estimates here, right, in terms of when they are spoken as another language, right. Now, we've looked at these patterns, right, where the languages are coming from, where they're ending up. But there are also reasons why they ended up where they did, right? Reasons why they are in the places that they are. And that has to do with diffusion of language, right? The way that language is spreading over time. Now, being in this course, you've looked at maps like these at least once, if not more than once, throughout the time we were in class. And here we're looking at, yes, colonization maps, right, which is one of the biggest historical factors for the spread of anything and everything, to be honest, but especially for language, and as we'll look at in the next video, especially for religion. All right, so we see the Americas, right, colonized by European powers, right, and all of these being groupings that had Indo-European languages. Right? We see parts of East and Southeast Asia, and South Asia as well, who were colonized by these areas. Excuse me. As well as Africa, right? That Berlin Conference, all right, the Conference of Berlin, where the colonial powers divided up the African continent to fit their needs. All right, now we're going to focus in on Africa now because we looked at the Americas and things like that, and it's pretty easy to see where that influence came from, right? As the Spanish came in and colonized, the areas where they had control led to the use of the Spanish language, right? Spanish is not indigenous to the Americas, right? To Latin America. It came from somewhere else, right? We have other languages indigenous to Latin American spaces, like Maya, like Quechua, but those languages, as we'll talk about later too, where they're kind of overshadowed in this way. Once these colonial powers come in and they convert the indigenous to their religions, as they convert people to their religions, they also teach them the language, and there's some forcible language teaching that happens there too, right? Where that language gets adopted by the people in these new areas, which is why we see, Spanish is a dominant language in Latin America, except for Brazil, right? Because it's the Portuguese. And then why we see English and French in North America so much, right? English throughout most of the United States, and even parts of Mexico as a second language. And then we have, French and English mixed in Canada, right? But we're going to look at Africa for now. We're going to look at Africa first. Now, we can see, of course, that Africa was colonized by a number of different groups over the years, and at the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. And of course, colonial rule is going to have influence on the culture and languages spoken here. But just to give you a preview, to give you an idea of just how much this was impacted, right? Because we know that the majority of these countries ended up being independent in the 1950s, right? But it was a good 40, 50 years of colonial rule, right? And these countries had their own indigenous languages too, right? They had their own languages that were developed on the continent that people spoke as native languages. Before they ended up becoming independent and speaking these new languages now. All right, so if we look at these languages now, we can see the African continent had a number of different language families that sprung up in its space, from Afro-Asiatic to Nilo-Saharan to Niger-Congo to Khoisan, Austronesian. All of these are the indigenous languages, right? But if we look at the official languages, right, those languages required by law in order for a government to distribute information, any public goods or services, right, that's the official language required by law to use that language in those government services or public services, as opposed to the standard language, which is just the language that people speak most often in a country. But we see that these language families were the indigenous ones, and we don't see Indo-European, which, if we looked at our other slide, or back to our slide, all of these are Indo-European groupings, right, or at least countries, powers that had Indo-European languages as their main languages. Now, if we look today to these languages and we look to their status, right, as official or not, we're going to find, Algeria, Arabic, Berber, all right, this one's pretty indigenous, right? We saw a spread of Arabic into these areas, but they have French as another spoken language, right? That's colonial influence. But then Angola, Portuguese, Benin, French, Botswana, English, Burkina Faso, French, Burundi, French, Cameroon, French, Cape Verde, Portuguese, Central African Republic, French, Chad, French, Comoros, French, the DRC, French, the Congo, French, Cote d'Ivoire, French, and we start to see this trend of language as a power, right? That's been so ingrained in these countries in Africa now that they have these Indo-European languages in official status as the ones that are required to be used, as opposed to the native languages that were there for hundreds, if not thousands of years before, right? That's influence, that's kind of colonial washing away of culture in these areas. And that's what we see, right, in terms of language diversity. as this happens, we start to see fewer and fewer speakers of an indigenous language because the dominant language takes over. It's a topic for another few minutes, but all right, this is the kind of thought process that we're looking at. Now, outside of this particular case, we've seen English in specific become entirely widespread, right? This is the British Empire at its peak, right? We can see that on every continent there was some touch of the British Empire. It's no mistake, right? The British sought to expand, sought to have colonial rule over a variety of areas. And if we look today to where English has some kind of official or meaningful status, these areas are, for the most part, the same, right? And this all contributes to English being what we call that lingua franca, right? This language used to communicate between people with different native languages. This language that historically has been used between people with different native languages for trade or for business. And that's in part because of the influence of English on these different regions of the world. Because now that it's established in these areas, now that it's present in these areas, trade becomes so much easier between people from these different regions, from these different world regions, because they can speak the same language. That's one barrier they can get across. That's one barrier that they can tear down by having this language commonality, right? So there is kind of a good and a bad with this washing away of languages, right, as colonial powers spread, because it helps contribute to this global interconnection, right, that globalization piece. Because if you can speak the same language, you can interact with other cultures much more easily and be more open to accepting these other cultures too. Now, other things contribute to English being a lingua franca, right, over time. In terms of journal articles, research, and science, we can see a ratio of English to local language journal articles, and we'll see that nearly in every space there are more articles published in English than in any other languages, even the native language, the local language of that country, right? So here we have about, for every single journal article we have published in the Netherlands as of 2011, we had about 43 articles published in English, right? Even though Dutch is that indigenous local languages in the Netherlands. For Italy, about 30-1, despite Italian being the local language. Germany, about 9-1. In Russia, right, 26-1, 27-1. Right, so we see the importance of English in science in particular, because the majority of languages, especially in Europe and these other countries that are contributing to scientific research and scientific endeavors, are publishing journals in English, right? That helps English become a lingua franca, because that means that you need to know English because the majority of research is going to be published in English. Or at the very least, you're going to want to interact with people who speak English in other countries, and that's going to end up being that lingua franca, right? If they don't speak the same native language, English is usually going to be that default for partially this reason, because it's the language of science and the language used to publish in scientific journals. Aside from that, social media has transformed the way that we think of English today. Right? Contemporarily, we see social media as a large spreader of the language, from the first social medias to things like Facebook, to Twitter, to Google Plus, and LinkedIn and things like that. We can see that the majority of usage on social media, whatever we're looking at, tends to be from English-speaking countries. By far, right? 156 million to 48 million for the next largest. Right? There's just a larger grouping of English language being used on the internet and on social media sites, and that's going to translate into the use of these languages and the use of these trends in other countries too. Right? We see here countries that were, India, right, which was colonized by Britain, which contributes to large English-speaking populations. Which coincides with kind of the spread of English through social media on its own. Now, we mentioned briefly this impact of language, right? And this is our closing grouping, because language does have an impact on the places it goes. We've talked a lot about how language has kind of transferred itself from place to place in whole, right, as one kind of single thing. But sometimes it doesn't happen, right? English can spread, French can spread, Spanish can spread, and the majority of the time it's going to spread as a whole, right? All the language gets transferred. Maybe some things change to create a new dialect, but the language stays relatively the same. In other cases, it changes. It interacts with the other languages around it, and we get something new. So this is where we have things that we call Pidgins and Creoles, right? And a Pidgin and a Creole are similar. They're both stemmed from different languages, but it's a matter of maturity, a matter of, how much those languages have changed and developed on their own. Now, a Pidgin is not a mother language. It's not going to be a native language, so there are no native speakers of a Pidgin. And a Pidgin arises when you have two speakers who can't speak a similar language, and they're still forced to interact with each other. So they're still going to try and talk with each other to interact, but they don't have a single common language that they can tie to. So you kind of get this mumbo jumbo that comes on. That Pidgin language that develops may eventually develop into a Creole, where it develops its own grammar, it develops its own vocabulary, based on the two languages or more that was being used to communicate previously. And eventually, it does get its own native speakers because it is a full-fledged language. If we look at commonalities between different Creoles, so we have French and Haitian Creole here, and then we have Patois and English here. Patois being an English Creole, Haitian Creole being a French Creole, and we can see kind of the similarities that are discovered. Right, these Creoles, for the most part, at least in Jamaica and areas surrounding it, and in Haiti, we saw this Creole develop as a result of course, colonization, right? So we saw this transatlantic slave trade that occurred, right, in the kind of mid-millennia. And we saw the majority of groupings, right, of Africans who were forced out of their home areas, their hearths. And a lot of those groupings went to South America and the Caribbean, right? Relatively few slaves ended up in the United States compared to these other regions, but that's why we see a larger influence, in these regions, and why we see larger blends of African culture, especially in areas like Brazil and the Caribbean, with other colonizing cultures that eventually developed, right? A lot of times, the slaves were learning the language by ear, right? So they're listening to the language, but they weren't being formally taught. So as this Creole developed, using their own, indigenous African language and the new language of the colonizers, be it French or English, things start to blend, right? Pronunciations, spellings, that eventually develop over time. But a lot of this is a result of learning a language by ear and then adapting it to fit their needs, right? So they can communicate with each other and communicate with the people who were enslaving them at the time, right? And eventually using it as a leverage, right, to gain independence. Now we can see here with Patois, T is T, ball is ball, shoot, right? And we see these kind of different pronunciations and spellings, but we can see that common trend, that common thread between the two languages. French and Haitian Creole, entendre, t'attendre, attendre, t'attendre, écouter, t'écouter. We see this kind of shortening of words, these new consonants and vowel sounds, things like that develop too. And that's all fine, that's all well and good, right? That's just how the Creole starts to develop. These languages, the Haitian Creole and the English Creoles like Patois, have native speakers, right? They developed full languages, they developed their own vocabulary, their own dialects even, right? And typically what we're going to see out of the Creole, again, these differences between a Creole and a Pidgin, it's going to have a native speaker population, it's going to have a large developed vocabulary and grammar, and typically this Creole is going to be a result of a native language, an indigenous language, and the language of colonizers, historically as we've seen, right? And most commonly we see French and English Creoles, especially in the Caribbean and especially in parts of South America, right? Aside from that, we see the other end, right, where languages may be diversified, but also where languages start to die out. Now here we have a map of Ireland, and we're looking at native Irish Gaelic speakers, right, the native language of Ireland, right, or the indigenous language of Ireland. And we can see here that very few people overall natively speak this Irish Gaelic, this kind of historic language that was there. We can see over time that those groupings have diminished, right? For various reasons. We see here in 1850 this great hunger period, right? That Irish potato famine, as we've learned it, right, in 8th grade and this year in part. And we can see that maybe some causes of migration were also causes for the language loss because the speakers had to leave or because people died out who spoke it. But over time, we can see that the number is just drastically decreased, right? From these last 200 years, where we had a majority of Ireland speaking that native Irish Gaelic, to now where we have relatively few people who actually speak it, except in these pockets, right? These clusters that we see in the north and in the west. Over time, we've seen revival methods come in, right? Because wherever language loss we see, we also see language revival. And usually that's in the form of education, formal education, right? Where they include these languages within the school curriculum to try and revive them and try and keep them spoken, or at the very least used or taught. And so here we have what we call L1 English and L2 Irish. So L2 meaning a second language, L1 meaning a first language. And we can see that by far, this is for Ireland, right, contemporarily, we see English as dominating over the Irish language, where we see many more speakers, many more students speaking English at a high level compared to that Irish, the native language at the high level. Now Hebrew, right, this language tied to the Jewish religion, has been one of these success stories, right? Irish is starting to see those successes where more people are going to start speaking Irish over time as they continue these programs. But Hebrew is one where they really implemented in the 1900s and the 1940s and 50s this Hebrew school, right? Where they have kind of, it's like CCE, CCD, right? For those of you who are Catholic or Catholic Christian, what have you. Where they go to learn about religion, but where they also learn their Hebrew language, right, for the Jewish people. And that's been part of the success in reviving Hebrew as a language, is using it in education so that the younger populations learn it early and learn it fluently, and then eventually they can pass it on to their students, or they can send their children to Hebrew school as well when they're of age, or when they have children of their own, to keep that language growing and prospering, right? But again, just as we see a language develop and change, like we did with Pidgins and Creoles, we can see a language die out, right? Where maybe that language develops and we get a new language entirely. Sometimes we lose the language as a more dominant one takes over instead. It does it for us. Longer than I expected for this video, but a lot of good info that's here. Hopefully it's helpful to you. And thanks for dropping in. Hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe.